Indochina. Things here have been evolving, or devolving, pretty rapidly since the end of the Second World War. There are Chinese troops in the north and French and British troops in the south, but the popularity of the communist movement is growing day by day. This situation cannot hold, and these growing tensions are about to create a perfect storm that will plunge the region into 3 decades of war. I'm Indy Neidell, and welcome back to War to War. Our story with Indochina, well, it actually goes back a long way, but we'll pick it up back in 1940 with the fall of France. Indochina is a French colony, and an important one at that. It provides a whole lot of rubber to French markets, and the plantations are dominated by the Pillsbury Doughboy's French cousin, the Michelin Man. This makes the region vital to the French automobile industry. Well, and a bunch of other French industry. With the fall of France, though, Indochina effectively finds itself cut off from the rest of the French Empire. Even more so when the British destroy part of the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir just over a week later and blockade or impound the rest, fearing those mighty ships might fall into German hands. So, with no troops and no ships to help out, Indochina is on its own. And this opens the door for Japan. Japan occupies Indochina in September 1940 after a one-sided fight with the colonial garrisons there, and a French Indochinese regime, Vichy French, headed by Jean Decoux, must tolerate a cohabitation with Japanese forces for the next 4.5 years. But it is, of course, the Allies who ultimately prevail in the war, and as the Allies' focus turns eastward as Germany collapses, Japan fears a surge of Free French activity in Indochina, and potentially even an invasion by the British or the Americans. On March 9, 1945, the Japanese disarm the French garrisons and take them prisoner, placing the region directly under Japanese control. And nobody knows it yet, but this event on March 9th is the first step in a chain reaction. How, you ask? Well, I'll get to that, but the world has not been standing still while all of this has been going on, and 2 major developments have already happened. On June 18, 1940, a still relatively unknown Charles de Gaulle, who arrives in England the day before, enters the studios of the BBC in London and is interviewed about the military debacle in France, his homeland. De Gaulle's thoughts that day were on the French Empire, whose resources he sensed could keep France in the war and fighting. And they were with Britain and the United States, great powers with whom he could ally. "Believe what I tell you," de Gaulle intoned into the microphone, "for I know of what I speak, and I say that nothing is lost for France." Then, like a cleric chanting a litany, he declared, "For France is not alone. She is not alone. She is not alone. She has a vast empire behind her. She can unite with the British Empire that rules the seas and is continuing the fight. Like Britain, she can make unlimited use of the immense industrial resources of the United States." De Gaulle, beyond the defeat of Germany, wants the survival of the French Empire and a resurgent France re-establishing itself as a great power. But he faces a hell of a challenge to get that done. And for all his talk of unity and common purpose between France and her subjects, he knows this is not the full picture. This brings us to the Brazzaville Conference of 1944, held in the French Congo. The conference discusses, among other things, the future French government's policy towards its imperial holdings. Free French policymakers erroneously believe that Republican reform and greater autonomy will be enough to satisfy nationalist sentiment in French colonies and hold the empire together, envisioning a new era of liberté, égalité, fraternité between the French and their subjects as part of a new federalized empire, the French Union. However, no indigenous delegations from Africa or Asia are invited to the conference. Beyond these overtures, perhaps the most important takeaway from the conference is that France will not entertain the independence movement sprouting up across the empire. De Gaulle intends to reclaim it all, Indochina included, which places him on a collision course with the leader of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh. And this is the second key event, the return of Ho Chi Minh to Indochina. He spent most of his life abroad and in exile, in France, Britain, the USA, and more recently the Soviet Union, where he develops his own political philosophies further and is influenced by the politics of Joseph Stalin. After the fall of France and the occupation of Indochina by the Japanese, Ho begins to see an opportunity to return home, this time on the crest of a revolutionary wave. He returns to Indochina in early 1941 and begins the long and arduous task of gathering support for the Viet Minh in northern Vietnam and southern China. He is actually arrested in China about a year later, in August 1942, under suspicion of conducting subversive activities on behalf of Mao Zedong's Communist China, and spends a year in prison there. He manages to use this to embellish his image further, showing himself to be struggling and suffering in pursuit of his homeland's freedom. By the time of his release in August 1943, the Viet Minh have a sizable support base in northern Tonkin, in the provinces of Cao Bang, Bac Can, and Lang Son. The fact that Indochina is partially occupied by the Japanese at this time proves to be a godsend for Ho's popularity, allowing him to attack both Jean Decoud's administration and the Japanese occupiers simultaneously, so he can advance the cause for independence without coming into direct conflict with the Allies or the Japanese. And speaking of the Allies, by this point, Ho is convinced that the Allies will ultimately win the war. He prepares to play the long game, understanding that his moment will come with the fall of Japan. On July 8, 1944, the French police discovered a Viet Minh base near Soc Giang in Cao Bang containing a sizable cache of arms, tracts, and clothing, and warned of the immediate need to re-establish authority. The following month, 2 village chiefs were assassinated, and several Viet Minh hideouts were discovered, confirming, the Sûreté reported, some voluntary support by the population. Louis Arnoux, the head of the Sûreté, had by then already identified the leader of the movement. In a letter to Decoud, he noted the effectiveness of the guerrilla tactics advocated by the propaganda leaflets printed in China by the anti-French parties, whose leader now seems to be Ho Chi Minh. Things really get moving in 1945 with the March 9th coup, and then the Japanese surrender later that year. With the French out of the picture after the coup, the Viet Minh find themselves with the ability to organize like never before. The French colonial police, who hounded them for years, had not been particularly effective, but still more so than the Japanese, for whom the region's long-term stability and security is not particularly high on the agenda. Ho's Viet Minh are able to harness the fallout from a major famine in 1944 and 45 to their political advantage as well. Harsh production quotas by the French and Japanese colonial administrations have eroded the quality of arable land through over-farming, and bad flooding in autumn 1944 destroys much of that season's crop in the north, which is unsuitable geographically for mass agriculture anyway, and already often dependent on imports from Cochinchina to the south. What rice is produced is mostly snapped up by the French and Japanese forces for their own use. The French stocks consequently falling into Japanese hands after the March 9th coup. With hundreds of thousands in the north starving, protests and riots break out, often trying to break into granaries and throw open the doors to the starving masses outside. In the absence of other groups, the Viet Minh are able to take control of these protests, leading and directing them effectively. Even though the protests are spontaneous originally, their involvement gives them a giant public image boost among the poor in northern Vietnam, even before Ho makes his move. On August 13th, following the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, high-ranking members of the Viet Minh meet in Tan Trao and discuss the imminent Japanese surrender. They decide that they need to preempt the French post-war return as quickly as possible and launch a nationwide insurrection a couple of days later. Towns and cities in Tonkin and Annam quickly fall under Viet Minh control, often with virtually no resistance. On the 19th, they take control of Hanoi, cementing Viet Minh control over Tonkin. Seeing the writing on the wall, Vietnamese puppet Emperor Bao Dai, through whom the Japanese have ruled since March, announces that he would support a Viet Minh nationalist government led by Ho Chi Minh. But by now, things have gone too far, and protests calling for Bao's abdication spring up in Hanoi. He then abdicates on August 25th, and a formal declaration of independence for the new Democratic Republic of Vietnam is issued by Ho's government on September 2nd. In the week-by-week episodes on our World War II channel, I covered this all in a bit more detail. A student present for the day of Bao Dai's abdication, recalls the scene. The royal family was grouped on the left-hand side of the courtyard. The crowd was thronging on the right. Suddenly, a man's voice cried out, "From this day on, royalty is abolished in Vietnam. Bao Dai is from here as the simple citizen Vinh Thuy, and now citizen Vinh Thuy has permission to speak." Next, Emperor Bao Dai, who looked very young, stepped forward. He addressed the crowd. "Citizens, let me be understood. I prefer to be a free citizen than an enslaved king." And this brings us now to the post-war era. France has missed the boat, so to speak, for a triumphant return to Indochina. Although de Gaulle is getting along better with U.S. President Harry Truman than he did with his predecessor, the far more anti-colonialist Franklin Roosevelt, he still found himself largely excluded from important decision-making and post-war planning. He was planning to send an expeditionary force to Indochina to have Frenchmen at the fore of those coming to reoccupy the region. As the war ends, though, Philippe Leclerc has but 979 men available to him in Ceylon. More troops can be brought in from France, but that'll take time. So it's British and Chinese troops who first enter Indochina in accordance with the Potsdam Declaration. The Chinese at the end of August and the British in mid-September. The Japanese surrender is officially received by these forces. The entire year has been a giant humiliation for French aims to reimpose control on Indochina. In the past 6 months, it's seen a revolution or coup, the end of World War II, the arrival of hundreds of thousands of foreign troops, but not a French unit among them. French forces do begin arriving later in September and begin forcibly retaking control of cities, towns, and major roads in the south with support of British and even some Japanese troops. These are the first real clashes between French and Viet Minh forces. Britain doesn't really pose a threat to French rule here. Britain has its own issues to focus on and its own empire to save. The British are here to facilitate the French return and don't really want to be here a day longer than they have to. With the Chinese troops, it's more complicated. Over 150,000 nationalist Chinese troops enter Indochina under the command of Liu Han and quickly occupy everything north of the 16th parallel. Other Vietnamese nationalist groups who have pinned all their hope on Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek begin to re-enter the country around this time too, hoping to persuade Chiang that Ho Chi Minh's administration poses a communist threat and to oust Ho in favor of their own movements. Chiang comes close to doing this on several occasions, but ultimately never gives that order. That means it's actually the French who stand to lose out by the Chinese presence. Ho's administration is allowed to quietly continue in the Chinese zone, solidifying their control, building popular support, and establishing a regular army of their own. So by the end of 1945, we have this somewhat absurd situation where foreign forces are helping both the Viet Minh and the French to establish themselves in their zones of control, while the two combatants themselves are held back from one another in the short term. All that's required now is for those safeguards to be removed, and the smallest spark might ignite a war for the future of Indochina. Those safeguards come down in March 1946. The Chinese insist, as a precursor to their departure, that the Viet Minh and the French come to some kind of accord, which they do on March 6. By the terms of this tentative agreement, Viet Minh-controlled Vietnam will join the Indo-Chinese Federation as a free state, administering itself and running its own taxation and spending, but still a nominal subject of France. 15,000 French troops will be permitted to re-enter the north, and France is required to arrange a referendum on the reunification of Cochinchina, now predominantly back under French control, with Ho's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV. Significantly, part of the accord also stipulated that the French forces would withdraw from the DRV within 5 years. This effectively allowed Ho to defend himself against anti-communist, nationalist charges that the communists were selling out the nation. It was in this precise context that Ho muttered to a French counterpart that it was better to sniff French crap for 5 years than to have to eat Chinese dung forever. So at least there's a chance that war can be avoided. Perhaps the two nations can work this out after all. Well, spoiler, no. If the terms of this accord seem to be too good to be true to anyone in the Viet Minh, it's because they are. The new French High Commissioner, Georges Dargenelou, a staunch conservative imperialist with little time for the opinions of the natives, is not exactly a natural fit in such an awkward and volatile situation. He despises the concessions granted by France in these agreements and is determined to wrest back control of Indochina fully and at any price. Throughout the first tense months of the agreement, Dargenelou is obstinate and opaque to representatives of the Viet Minh, rarely communicating at all and being needlessly snippy and pedantic when forced to sit down and talk. However, his first actual violation of the accords comes on June 1st. At his direction, French-occupied Cochinchina is declared an autonomous republic, directly violating the promise of a reunification referendum there. With the agreement now broken, any trust which may have been built over the previous months is gone, and confrontations between French troops and the Viet Minh become more commonplace. Despite Ho Chi Minh's willingness to continue to negotiate, it is slowly becoming increasingly clear that Dargenelou favors a military solution in the north. Then, something happens in Haiphong. On November 20th, a French patrol vessel seizes a Chinese junk. Now, there's been a long-running dispute in Haiphong about whether the Viet Minh or the French have the authority to administer the port and collect customs duties. So the local Viet Minh choose to perceive the French seizure as a criminal act and board the French patrol ship, arresting its crew. A night of great unrest follows, including open firefights between the Viet Minh and French troops, leaving some 250 Vietnamese and 7 French dead by morning. A ceasefire is agreed the next day, and the Vietnamese sun sets and rises one final time before the fine line between shaky peace and all-out war is crossed. The 22nd, the local French commander receives new orders from his superior, Jean-Étienne Valois. Take maximum advantage of this incident in order to improve our position in Haiphong. It seems clear we are facing premeditated aggression, carefully planned by the regular Vietnamese army, which seems no longer to be following its government's orders. The moment has arrived to teach a hard lesson to those who have so treacherously attacked us. By every possible means, you must take complete control of Haiphong and force the Vietnamese government and army into submission. The next day, November 23rd, the slaughter begins. French warships open up on the city, targeting the Vietnamese and Chinese quarters, while aircraft pound the area from the skies and French troops move through the streets, meeting resistance with gunfire. By the end of that day, at least 2,000 Vietnamese civilians will be dead, and the full number of casualties will never be accurately known. Yet, even as the dust settles, an optimistic Ho Chi Minh scrambles to get the French back to the negotiating table and prevent the spiral into war. That time has now passed. Dargenelou, far from being alarmed by Valois' actions, cables his congratulations and approval for the massacre. The fight can no longer be avoided, and the actions of a few men have finally set Vietnam on a path to a series of military conflicts that will define the second half of the 20th century, perhaps more than any others. On December 19th, the Viet Minh-controlled Democratic Republic of Vietnam enters a state of war with the French Empire. The Indochina War has begun, and we shall see where it heads over the coming months and years, right here on War to War. It is thanks to TimeGhost Army, the TimeGhost Army, that we produce this series, and all of our series. You too can join the TimeGhost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Jeremy Irvine is the TimeGhost Army Member of the Week for War to War. These are the newest commissioned officers, and if you have not yet seen it, we have an entire channel dedicated to the struggle between communist forces and UN forces in the Korean War. It is great, and you can check it out right here. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.